The hardest part about disappearing is realizing how few people notice. Rain hammered the sidewalks of Manhattan as I pulled my thin coat tighter around my body and stared across the street at Moretti's, one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York. Golden light spilled from the massive windows, washing the wet pavement in warm reflections. Inside, people laughed over expensive dinners. Outside, the October wind cut through me like ice. The contrast felt almost cruel. I checked my phone again, even though I already knew what I would find. No new messages. No missed calls. No miracles. My bank account balance remained exactly where it had been an hour earlier. My stomach tightened. I had spent the last 6 months convincing myself things would get better. One more shift. One more class. One more sacrifice. That was what I kept telling myself. But life had a way of collecting debts all at once. My nursing classes were becoming harder to afford. The bills for my aunt's medical treatment kept growing. The apartment I rented was already 3 weeks overdue. Every day felt like a race against disaster. And lately, disaster was winning. I sat down on a cold bench across from the restaurant and tried to steady my breathing. Around me, hundreds of people hurried through the rain beneath umbrellas and glowing storefront signs. Nobody looked in my direction. Nobody noticed the young woman sitting alone in soaked clothes while clutching a folder filled with overdue notices and rejection emails. New York was strange that way. You could be surrounded by millions of people and still feel invisible. I lowered my eyes and stared at the folder resting in my lap. Just looking at it made my chest ache. Earlier that morning, I had received another rejection from a hospital internship program. The third one this month. They all used different words, but they meant the same thing. Not selected. Not chosen. Not enough. A bitter laugh escaped me. The sound disappeared into the rain. Across the street, a sleek black car pulled up in front of Moretti's. Valets rushed forward immediately. Men in tailored suits stepped out beneath umbrellas. They looked confident, certain, like the world had already decided to say yes to them. I wondered what that felt like. The wind grew stronger. A sudden wave of dizziness rolled through me. I closed my eyes and pressed 2 fingers against my temple. I had skipped lunch. And dinner. Again. It was becoming a bad habit. One that my body was no longer willing to ignore. The city lights blurred together when I stood. For a second, the entire street seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I grabbed the edge of the bench and waited for the sensation to pass. It did not. Instead, another wave hit harder. My folder slipped from my hands. Papers scattered across the wet sidewalk. Bills, forms, applications, tiny pieces of a life falling apart. I bent down instinctively to gather them, but my legs felt weak. The rain seemed louder now, the traffic more distant. Everything around me began drifting out of focus. Then, without understanding why, I looked up toward the restaurant. High above the main dining room, behind a wall of glass, a tall man stood alone in a private office overlooking the street. Even from a distance, there was something powerful about him. Still, silent, watching. Our eyes met for the briefest moment. Then darkness rushed in around the edges of my vision, and the last thing I felt was the cold rain against my face before the world disappeared. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I noticed was silence. Not complete silence. Manhattan never allowed that. But it was the kind of quiet that only existed high above the city, where traffic became a distant hum and rain sounded like a soft whisper against glass. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then the warmth registered. A thick blanket covered me. The air smelled faintly of coffee and cedar. My head rested against a leather sofa instead of a cold sidewalk. Confusion replaced panic. I sat up too quickly and immediately regretted it. The room tilted slightly before settling again. Take your time. The voice came from across the room. Deep, calm, controlled. I turned toward the sound. A man stood near a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly behind him. Even without the rain and distance, I recognized him instantly. He was the man from the private office above the restaurant. The man who had been watching. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit. One hand rested in his pocket while the other held a cup of coffee. There was something unsettling about how still he stood, like nothing around him could move unless he allowed it. Where am I? My voice sounded weak. He set the cup down on a nearby table. A private lounge above my restaurant. My eyes moved around the room. Everything looked expensive without feeling flashy. Dark wood, soft lighting, modern furniture. Near the sofa sat a neatly organized stack of papers. My papers. Every bill. Every application. Every notice that had scattered across the sidewalk. My stomach tightened immediately. Did you go through those? The question came out sharper than intended. The man glanced toward the stack. No. His answer was simple. My staff collected them before the rain ruined everything. Heat rushed into my face. Embarrassment always seemed determined to arrive at the worst moments. Thank you, I said quietly. He nodded once. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The silence should have felt uncomfortable. Instead, it felt strangely calm. Finally, he stepped closer. Do you remember what happened? I laughed softly. I remember making a complete fool of myself in front of one of the most expensive restaurants in New York. Something almost resembling amusement touched his expression. Almost. You collapsed because you were exhausted. I looked away. Hearing someone else say it made it sound worse. More real. I am fine. The words came automatically. He studied me for a moment. No. His voice remained calm. You are not. I opened my mouth to argue and then stopped. Because for once, I did not have the energy to pretend. Outside, rain continued sliding down the glass. The city beyond looked beautiful, distant, untouchable. The man walked toward a nearby chair and sat down across from me. My name is Luca Moretti. I knew the name immediately. Everyone in Manhattan knew it. Successful restaurateur, influential businessman, powerful enough that people lowered their voices when discussing him. My heartbeat quickened slightly. Luca noticed. He seemed to notice everything. Then his gaze shifted toward the stack of papers beside me. When he looked back at me, something had changed in his expression. Not judgment, not pity, concern, genuine concern. Sophia, he said quietly, how long have you been carrying all of this by yourself? Sometimes a question hurts more than a judgment. I stared at Luca and realized I did not know how to answer him. How long had I been carrying everything by myself? A few years if we were talking about responsibility. Much longer if we were talking about fear. I looked down at my hands and traced the edge of the blanket resting across my lap. Long enough? I said quietly. Luca remained silent, waiting. Most people rushed to fill uncomfortable moments. He did not. He simply sat there, watching, as though he understood that some truths needed time to surface. Outside, rain continued running down the massive windows. The city lights shimmered through the glass like distant stars. My parents passed away when I was younger, I finally said. The words felt strangely heavy. I rarely spoke about them. After that, my aunt raised me. Luca nodded slightly. His expression never changed. She is the one receiving treatment? Yes. My voice softened. She worked 2 jobs for years so I could have a future. I looked away. When she got sick, there was no way I was leaving her alone. Silence settled between us again. This time it felt different. More personal somehow. I stared out at the city while memories drifted through my mind. Long nights studying nursing textbooks after work. Hospital waiting rooms. Bills stacked across kitchen tables. Endless calculations trying to stretch money farther than money could stretch. You gave up opportunities. Luca's voice interrupted my thoughts. It was not a question. I laughed softly. Several. Why? The answer came immediately. Because family matters. For the first time, something shifted in his eyes. Respect, recognition, maybe even understanding. Most people would not make that choice. I shrugged. Then most people did not know my aunt. A faint smile touched his face. Small, brief, real. The expression disappeared almost instantly, but I noticed it anyway. Then his attention moved toward the folder beside me. And now, he asked. I followed his gaze. Every paper inside represented another problem waiting for a solution. Now I work as many shifts as possible. I laughed again. There was no humor in it. I study when I can, sleep when I can, hope when I can. Luca leaned back slightly. And eat when you can? Heat rushed into my cheeks. Apparently, I had not hidden that part very well. I have been busy. One eyebrow lifted. That is a creative way to describe skipping meals. Despite myself, I smiled. The room felt lighter for a moment. Then reality returned. It always did. The truth is, I am tired. The words escaped before I could stop them. I stared down at my hands. I am tired of worrying. Tired of pretending everything is fine. Tired of wondering which bill gets paid first. My voice cracked slightly. Embarrassment followed immediately. I hated sounding weak. Luca did not interrupt. He did not offer empty encouragement. He simply listened. Somehow that made it easier to continue. The worst part is not failing, I admitted quietly. It is feeling invisible while you are trying not to fail. The room became completely still. Even the rain seemed quieter. Lucas studied me for several seconds. Then he stood and walked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. The city stretched endlessly beneath him. Powerful, beautiful, unforgiving. Finally, he turned back toward me. His expression had become unreadable again. Calm, certain, dangerous in a way I could not explain. Sophia, he said quietly, I think you have spent so much time surviving that you forgot something important. My heartbeat quickened. What? His eyes held mine. You deserve a future too. Sometimes hope feels more frightening than despair. I stared at Luca after he spoke those words and felt something unfamiliar settle inside my chest. For months, maybe years, I had become comfortable expecting disappointment. It was easier that way. If you never expected good things, you never had to survive losing them. Yet sitting in that quiet room above the city, I realized he was asking me to consider something I had stopped allowing myself to imagine. A future. I looked away first. That sounds nice. My voice barely rose above a whisper. Lucas studied me carefully. You do not believe it. I laughed softly. Belief requires evidence. One corner of his mouth lifted. Fair answer. Outside, the rain finally began to weaken. The city lights appeared sharper through the glass. Traffic moved below like streams of white and red flowing through Manhattan. Everything looked alive. Moving forward, I wondered when I had stopped doing the same. Luca walked toward a cabinet near the far side of the room and removed a small folder. He returned and placed it on the table between us. I stared at it cautiously. What is that? Information. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were documents about a nursing scholarship foundation, internship programs, training opportunities, resources I had spent months searching for on my own. My heart immediately began racing. How did you find all this? Luca sat down across from me again. I have people who are very good at finding things. The answer somehow told me nothing and everything at the same time. I looked through the pages one by one. Several opportunities were still accepting applications. Some offered financial assistance. Others offered housing support. My throat tightened. These were not fantasies. They were real, tangible, possible. I cannot accept charity. The words came automatically. Lucas sighed quietly, almost as if he had expected them. Sophia. I looked up. What? Why do you keep calling every opportunity charity? The question caught me off guard. Because someone else found it for me. No. His voice remained calm. Someone else showed it to you. He pointed toward the folder. You still have to earn it. I stared down at the papers again. The distinction felt small. Yet somehow it changed everything. Luca leaned back in his chair. You spent years taking care of someone you love. His gaze never left mine. You worked, studied, sacrificed. You did not fail because you lacked ability. The room felt unusually quiet. Every word seemed to land with impossible precision. Then why does it feel like I failed? I asked. Luca was silent for several seconds, long enough that I thought he might not answer. Finally, he looked toward the city skyline. Because good people often blame themselves for circumstances they never controlled. The statement lingered between us. I thought about every rejection letter, every unpaid bill, every night spent wondering what more I could have done. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had been carrying guilt that never belonged to me. Then Luca's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen briefly before setting it aside. Whatever message appeared did not seem urgent. Instead, he looked back at me with an expression I could not quite read. Calm, certain, almost protective. Tomorrow morning, he said quietly, I want you to make one promise. My heartbeat quickened. What promise? His eyes held mine. Promise me you will stop deciding your future based on your worst day. I looked at Luca and realized nobody had ever asked me for that kind of promise before. People usually asked for results. Better grades. More work. More effort. More sacrifice. Nobody had ever asked me to stop defining myself by my failures. The idea felt almost impossible. I do not know if I can do that. My voice was quiet. Honest. Luca nodded slowly. That is not what I asked. A small laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Somehow he always managed to do that. Turn my own words around and hand them back with a different meaning. You are very persistent. I have been told that. His expression remained calm, but there was the slightest hint of amusement in his eyes. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The city beyond the windows looked cleaner somehow. The streets reflected thousands of lights, transforming Manhattan into a river of gold and silver. I stared at the skyline and wondered when I had last taken time to appreciate it. Lately, I had only noticed the obstacles, the bills, the deadlines, the fear. Beauty requires space. Survival leaves very little room for that. Luca rose from his chair and walked toward the window. "Do you know something interesting about New York?" he asked. I looked up. "What?" His gaze remained fixed on the city below. "Everyone comes here chasing a different dream." The lights reflected across the glass around him. Some achieve it, some do not. But the city keeps moving either way. I frowned slightly. That is not very encouraging. A faint smile appeared. "I am not finished." He turned back toward me. "The people who succeed are rarely the people with the easiest path." His voice remained steady. "Certain. They are usually the people who keep going after life gives them a reason to stop." The words settled heavily inside me. Because lately, life had given me plenty of reasons to stop. More than I wanted to count. I looked down at the scholarship information spread across the table. Every page represented possibility. Yet possibility had become frightening. Hope always carried risk. Hope meant believing something good could happen. And believing meant disappointment could hurt again. Lucas seemed to notice the conflict immediately. "You are doing it again." I sighed. "Doing what?" "Arguing with opportunities before they arrive." I opened my mouth to defend myself, then closed it again. Because he was right. I had spent so long preparing for failure that success felt suspicious. Silence settled over the room. Comfortable. Thoughtful. Then the door opened quietly. A man in a dark suit stepped inside and approached Luca. He spoke softly enough that I could not hear the conversation. Luca listened without interrupting. When the man finished, he nodded once. The man left immediately. The entire exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet something about it reminded me how different our worlds were. Mine revolved around surviving one day at a time. His seemed to operate on an entirely different level. When the door closed, Luca returned to his seat. "I should get you home." The statement caught me off guard. My stomach tightened instantly. Home. The word felt complicated these days. Luca noticed my reaction. Of course he did. His expression softened slightly. "Or wherever you were staying." I looked away toward the city. The truth sat heavily in my chest. Because the place I had been staying was no longer available after tomorrow morning. And for the first time all evening, I realized I had absolutely no idea where I was going next. I stared at the city because it was easier than looking at Luca. The lights outside blurred slightly as a familiar knot formed in my chest. I had spent months becoming an expert at hiding uncomfortable truths. Unfortunately, some truths refused to stay hidden forever. "Sophia." Luca's voice was calm, patient. "Where are you staying?" I swallowed hard. The answer felt embarrassing now that it had become real. "A small rental room in Queens." He nodded once. "Waiting." I already knew what came next. "And?" I looked down at my hands. "The owner needs the room back." Silence settled over the lounge. I hated silence when it followed an admission like that. It always felt too close to pity. "When?" Luca asked. "Tomorrow." The word barely left my lips. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, the clouds had finally begun to break apart. Patches of clear sky appeared above Manhattan. The storm was ending. My own situation felt far less certain. I forced a smile that fooled absolutely no one. "I will figure something out." Luca leaned back slightly. "You keep saying that." Heat rushed into my face. "Because it is true." One eyebrow lifted. "Is it?" I opened my mouth, ready to defend myself, then stopped. Because the truth was complicated. I always figured something out eventually. The problem was the cost. Every solution required another sacrifice. More sleep lost. More stress. More compromises. More pretending everything was fine when it clearly was not. Lucas studied me for several seconds. Then he stood and walked toward the windows. The city lights reflected across the glass behind him. He looked like a man completely at ease with power. Not loud power. Not the kind that needed attention. The quieter kind. The kind that made people listen when he spoke. "A long time ago," he said, still facing the skyline, "my younger sister had a habit of hiding problems." I looked up. This was the first time he had mentioned her directly. His voice remained steady, but something softer lingered beneath it. She thought asking for help would make her a burden. My chest tightened. The words sounded painfully familiar. Luca finally turned back toward me. "She spent so much time protecting everyone else that she forgot she deserved support too." The room grew quiet again. I looked away first. You think I am doing the same thing? I know you are. The answer came immediately, without judgment, without hesitation, just certainty. I stared down at the scholarship papers spread across the table. Every opportunity in front of me required one thing I had been avoiding. Trust. Trusting that things could improve. Trusting that accepting help did not make me weak. Trusting that tomorrow might look different from yesterday. None of those came naturally anymore. Then Luca returned to the table and placed a small envelope beside the folder. I frowned. What is this? Information. I laughed despite myself. That seems to be your favorite answer. A faint smile appeared. Open it. I hesitated before sliding the contents out. Inside was an address. Nothing more. Just an address and a key card. My heartbeat immediately accelerated. I looked up. Luca. He met my eyes calmly. A furnished company apartment. Temporary. Safe. Private. I shook my head before he even finished. I cannot. His expression never changed. Why? Because it is too much. The answer came instantly. Luca held my gaze. Sophia, sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is accept a lifeline. The room felt impossibly still. Then he glanced toward the address in my hands and added one final sentence. Especially when they have spent far too long trying to swim alone. Sometimes the difference between fear and hope is a single decision. I stared at the key card resting in my hand and felt both emotions fighting for space inside my chest. Everything about the situation felt unreal. 24 hours earlier, I had been worrying about how to pay another bill. Now a man I barely knew was offering me a safe place to stay and opportunities one had spent months chasing alone. Common sense told me to be cautious. Yet every instinct I had developed over the years told me something else. Luca had never once asked for anything in return. He had simply helped. The thought felt strangely unfamiliar. You do not have to decide tonight. Luca's voice pulled me from my thoughts. I looked up. He was watching me with the same calm expression he always seemed to wear. Most people would pressure someone into an answer. A faint smile appeared. I am not most people. That much was obvious. Silence settled between us again. Comfortable now. The kind that exists when two people stop pretending they need to impress each other. Outside, the storm had completely passed. The skyline looked sharper than before. Cleaner. As if the city itself had been given a fresh start. Eventually, I slipped the key card back into the envelope. Can I ask you something? Luca nodded. You already are. I laughed despite myself. Then my expression softened. Why restaurants? The question seemed to surprise him. Out of everything we had discussed that evening, it was probably the last thing he expected. He glanced toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. My mother loved them. His answer came quietly. She believed food brought people together. I listened carefully. Something about his voice had changed. Less guarded. More personal. When I was younger, she used to say that every table held a different story. A small smile touched his face. She was usually right. For a moment, I could almost picture it. A younger version of Luca. A family gathered around a table. Simpler days before responsibility and power changed everything. Then the smile faded. After she passed away, I spent years chasing success because it felt easier than dealing with loss. His eyes drifted back toward the city. The problem is that success can fill your schedule. It cannot fill an empty room. The words lingered between us. Honest. Unexpected. I realized this was the first time he had truly spoken about himself. Not the businessman. Not the powerful figure everyone knew. Just Luca. And for the first time all evening, I saw the loneliness beneath the confidence. It looked familiar. Different circumstances. Same feeling. You miss them. It was not a question. He nodded once. Every day. The room fell silent again. Yet this silence felt heavier. More meaningful. Because now I understood something important. Luca was not helping me because he felt sorry for me. He was helping because he understood what it felt like to lose something important. To carry responsibility. To keep moving when part of you wanted to stop. Then his phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen briefly before looking back at me. There is something else you should know. My heartbeat quickened slightly. The seriousness in his voice changed the atmosphere immediately. What? Luca folded his hands and held my gaze. One of the nursing programs from that folder reviewed your application months ago. I frowned. And his expression became unreadable. Calm. Certain. They never rejected you. The room suddenly felt very still. Because if that was true, then everything I believed about my biggest failure was about to change. For a moment, I thought I had heard him incorrectly. The words hung in the air between us, refusing to make sense. I stared at Luca and searched his expression for any sign that he was joking. There was none. What do you mean they never rejected me? My voice came out softer than I intended. Luca remained calm. Exactly what I said. I shook my head slowly. That is impossible. No. His gaze never left mine. Just unfortunate. The room suddenly felt smaller. Every rejection letter, every unanswered email, every night spent wondering what I lacked came rushing back at once. I received a notice. Luca nodded. You received a notice generated after the application process closed. My heartbeat quickened. That is still a rejection. Not necessarily. He leaned forward slightly. Sophia, there is a difference between being rejected and never being fully reviewed. Silence filled the lounge. I stared at the scholarship documents spread across the table and felt my entire understanding of the past year begin to shift. The nursing program had been my first choice. The one opportunity one had wanted more than anything else. When the notice arrived, I assumed the answer was simple. Someone better had been selected. Someone smarter, more qualified, more deserving. I spent months carrying that conclusion without questioning it. Why are you telling me this? Luca's expression softened slightly. Because you built an entire story around a disappointment that was never fully true. I looked away. The statement landed harder than I expected. Because deep down, I knew he was right. Failure had become part of my identity. Every setback reinforced the belief that life was moving forward without me. What if that belief had been wrong? Outside, the clouds continued drifting apart above Manhattan. The city glowed beneath them, bright, restless, alive. For the first time all evening, I noticed how different everything looked now compared to when I had arrived. Earlier, the skyline felt distant, untouchable. Now it felt closer somehow, like possibility existed again. Then my phone vibrated on the table. The sound startled me. I glanced down at the screen and froze. An email notification appeared across the display. My stomach immediately tightened. The sender was the nursing program. Luca noticed my reaction. Of course he did. Open it. I looked up. How did you know? A faint smile appeared. Because some opportunities simply take longer to find the right person. My hands trembled as I unlocked the screen. The email opened slowly. Every second felt endless. Then I read the first sentence. My heart stopped. The program was reopening several positions after a funding expansion. Previous applicants were being invited to interview. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. It still did not feel real. Luca. My voice barely worked. He watched quietly while I stared at the screen. This changes everything. The words escaped before I could stop them. For the first time since entering the lounge, genuine hope overwhelmed fear. The future suddenly felt larger than my problems. Larger than my mistakes. Larger than the storm that had brought me here. Luca stood and walked toward the windows. The city lights reflected around him. Powerful. Certain. Yet somehow less distant than before. Then he looked back at me and spoke the words I would remember long after that night ended. No, Sophia. His voice was steady. This simply proves your future was never as small as you believed it was. 1 year later, I found myself standing in front of a hospital window, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold. The view was beautiful, but what truly amazed me was how different my life felt from the one I had been living 12 months earlier. The nursing program had changed everything. The interview led to acceptance. The acceptance led to opportunities one once believed belonged to other people. I was now completing the final stage of my clinical training, and for the first time in years, I woke up excited about the future instead of afraid of it. My aunt's health had improved as well. Slowly, steadily. The road had not been easy, but it had been possible. And sometimes possible was all a person needed. My phone vibrated gently in my pocket. I smiled before even looking at the screen. Some habits never changed. 5 minutes later, I stepped outside the hospital and found Luca waiting near the curb. The morning sunlight reflected across the windows of nearby buildings. He looked exactly as he had the night we met. Calm, confident, impossibly composed. Yet there was something different now. A lightness that had not existed before. You are smiling, he said. That usually means good news. I laughed softly. I was just thinking. One eyebrow lifted. Dangerous activity. I shook my head. I was thinking about that night. His expression softened immediately. Neither of us needed to explain which night. The The memory remained clear. Rain. Exhaustion. A restaurant glowing across the street. One decision that changed everything. We began walking together along the sidewalk. The city moved around us in a familiar rhythm. People rushing to work. Taxis passing by. Coffee shops opening their doors. New York continuing its endless motion. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not looked out that window? I asked. Luca was quiet for several seconds. No. The answer surprised me. Why not? He glanced toward me. Because I did look. Simple. Direct. Certain. Somehow that answer felt perfectly like him. We continued walking in comfortable silence. Then I stopped and looked back toward the skyline. A year earlier, the city had felt enormous. Unforgiving. A place where people disappeared without anyone noticing. Now it felt different. Not because the city had changed. Because I had. Luca followed my gaze. What are you thinking about now? I smiled. That sometimes one person can change another person's entire life. For the first time all morning, a genuine smile appeared on his face. Rare. Real. That works both ways, Sophia. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Because I understood exactly what he meant. He thought he had rescued a stranger that night. The truth was more complicated. He had given me hope when I had none left. But somewhere along the way, I had given him something too. A reason to open the parts of himself he had kept locked away for years. We stood together beneath the bright Manhattan sky, watching a new day begin. And as I looked at the man who had once given a simple order to bring me inside from the rain, I realized the greatest turning points in life rarely announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive quietly. Sometimes they begin with kindness. And sometimes they start the moment someone decides that a stranger is worth saving.